Well, it's that time again for another episode of Bad Therapists. Today's episode begins in Tucson, Arizona in December of 2018. See, the now ex-husband of a former patient of this therapist has filed a complaint that the therapist and patient had an unprofessional relationship outside of the therapeutic one. Now, in this case, unlike others I've talked about, there was no sexual activity reported by any of the parties involved. Instead, there was continued contact after therapy had ended. Specifically in the form of text messages and phone calls. The therapist claimed they were trying to support the patient, but acknowledged that they crossed a line. And the therapist even admits that they were not actually equipped or trained to treat the mental health issues described by the patient. So despite over 40 calls that lasted 30 to 60 minutes from 11 p.m. to 12 a.m. in the morning, the board put this therapist on probation for a year. And that might have been the end of the story if not for new complaints that came up while the therapist was still on probation. In this case, a client from Virginia, where the therapist had been licensed years before they came to Arizona. And I know you're about to experience feelings of shock and or awe, but the same thing happened before. In this case, it started with therapy that kept getting longer and longer, from once a week to twice a week to 3 times a week to 2 90-minute sessions a week. All while the therapist provided the client with their cell phone and personal email and said, "You have free reign to contact me whenever you'd like." And while again there was no sexual activity, there was back rubs, hand massages, neck massages, long hugs, and hand holding during therapy sessions. Oh, and the therapist didn't do anything they were supposed to do when the client attempted suicide. Oh, and when the client complained that maybe all of this extra contact was making them dependent on the therapist simply replied, "Don't worry, I'll never leave you, and your intense feelings are totally normal." Oh, and a month later, the patient that I mentioned at the beginning, they contacted the board and changed their story and said, "We actually did have a consensual sexual relationship and even exchanged explicit photos." Needless to say, at that point, probation went to "Please surrender your license," which this person did. And so that's the story. What? Oh, one more thing. A year later, one of their former clients posted on Reddit looking for a therapist, and this therapist responded because they were still claiming to be a licensed therapist, just now working outside of their home or in local coffee shops. Fortunately, another former client saw the Reddit post and told this person, "Hey, they're not actually licensed." And all of the communications were sent to the board, and a cease and desist order was sent out. At this point, at least, it looks like they've complied. That really is all for now. Stay tuned for the next episode of Bad Therapists.